Okay, so now we're getting into the subject of myths and history, as well as some of the most important of the Greek myths that I had you guys read. So in a class like this, there's often not time to go into as much detail as I would like. But I wanted to give you guys a summary of some of the famous myths and what we can learn from them. I had that Greek and Roman mythology stories reading for you. And the first one I had in there is the story of the Minotaur. So the Minotaur um, is a story of a tragic, I guess you could say a tragic love or a tragic fixation. So the story is about this king called Minos who lived on the island of Crete. And the story says that he had this very mighty empire. This empire, controlled other parts of Greece. But King Minos, for all his power, actually offended the gods. Poseidon sent this beautiful white bull out of the sea to be King Minos's. Except that Poseidon said, Minos, you've got to sacrifice this bull to me at the end of a certain amount of time, like a year or so. And King Minos agreed. He promised Poseidon this, but then he decided that the bull was just too cool. He was, having fun showing it off to all of his friends, and he was feeling very cool and powerful about it because he was an arrogant man. And so he says, you know what? I'm not going to sacrifice this bull. And so Poseidon says, okay, well, I'm going to make your wife fall in love with the bull. So Queen Pasiphae fell in love with the bull, and this led to, naturally, a human bull hybrid baby. Of course, this took some doing. She actually had to consult with Daedalus, who is sort of the master inventor of Greek mythology. She asked Daedalus to create a mechanical cow suit for her so that she could have sex with this bull. Not to put a too fine a point on it. But this is sort of, so one thing we're learning about Greek mythology already, very wild, very full of strange and bizarre things. And not afraid to put some weird things about sexuality in there. And so now Minos had, this hybrid baby he didn't know what to do with. And this baby was called the Minotaur, which means the bull of Minos, the bull of Minos or Minos. So he had Daedalus build him a great maze. And this maze was called the Labyrinth. So in this labyrinth, he kept the Minotaur, but the Minotaur ate human flesh. And so this was a problem. So he was this great king, so he had the other cities of Greece send 7 of their sons and daughters every so often, some stories say every year, to be sacrificed to the Minotaur. And so they were led into the maze and they got lost in the maze, and the Minotaur snuck up on them and ate them. But then one year, Theseus, the hero of Athens, and the son of the king of Athens, volunteered as tribute. He decided to slay the Minotaur instead. So he smuggled weapons in. And he actually had some help from Minos' daughter, Ariadne. Ariadne was a princess of Crete. She helped, if some stories say she fell in love with Theseus. And she gave him a spool of thread. Now, this connects to sort of gender roles in mythology because women are associated with weaving in traditional ancient Greek culture. But also, it's a clever ploy because Theseus is able to follow the thread back out through the labyrinth. So he knows where he's been and he doesn't get lost. And then he is able to slay the Minotaur. Then he escapes with Ariadne, and depending on the story, which version of the story you read, sometimes he dumps her on an island and Dionysus finds her instead, or sometimes Dionysus just steals her from him. And then after that, Theseus sails home, but he was supposed to change the color of his sails from white to black to tell the king, his father, that he was still alive, that he hadn't died. And unfortunately, he forgot, and so the king jumped off a cliff. And that was how Theseus became the king of Athens. So these stories, not adverse to extreme grandiose tragedy. So that's the story of the Minotaur. It's a fun and interesting one. And one thing that has come up in the last, I guess 100 years or so, is that there actually some ways in which this myth connects to history. Now, on the face of it, you might think like, how could this connect to history? This is a story about a human-animal hybrid creature and involves lots of stuff by the gods. How could this connect to history? So thinking about that, maybe think: is there what would be the way? What do we see that seems like it's connected to something real? Well, one thing we notice is that there's the story of a king with a great empire, and could that be connected to something real? And it seems like historians and archaeologists on the early part of the 20th century did some investigating, literally did some digging, and found some reason to think that it was. So this is a guy named Sir Arthur J. Evans. He's a bit of a wacky dude, but all the archaeologists in this time period are wacky because they don't really follow a good procedure like we do today. I'd say Arthur Evans is better than most, but he still had some wackiness to him. So what he found was a empire on Crete in pretty much the locations that we would expect it to. So on that island, at the place not far from where Knossos was said to be, he found an ancient palace. And he named the people who lived in this palace Minoans. So Minoans, be the people of King Minos. We don't know what these people actually called themselves, but it's very exciting to find people in the right place at the right time, to be an ancient empire that used to rule Greece. And furthermore, there were some connections that were found to the myth. If you look at the palace layout, it's very confusing, isn't it? It would be very hard to get through. And of course, that's by design to keep people from, invading, probably, and to store a lot of stuff, a lot of grain. But, it's a very confusing layout. And we might say that it feels almost like a labyrinth, like a great maze. Another thing we know about the palace at Knossos is that there were double axes. And the double axes, the double axe is a labrys. And this is actually where we get the word labyrinth, means the place of the double axes. And in this particular labyrinth of the palace, what do we have in the center? We have a big open area. And what would we expect to find at the center of this court? Well, we might expect to find a Minotaur. And it turns out that the Minoan culture did have a thing for bulls. We found, for instance, this beautiful drinking cup that if you put it up to your head, might make you look kind of like you were a Minotaur, and just shows, it seems like there was a certain kind of reverence for bulls in their society. Now, they are not the only culture to have this. The Mesopotamians, who we're going to look at, had some reverence for bulls as well. But here, it seems maybe that's the reason for the myth. They also had a particular tradition around the bull, which looks almost like a rodeo or like a bullfight. We tend to call it bull leaping. So someone would leap onto the back of the bull and then it seems like try to leap off the other side too. And so we have 2 women and 1 man engaged with this bull and maybe trying to hold its horns, maybe doing a dance around it, some people thought. It's pretty interesting. And that is what the central court would be used for in a lot of times. We also have little figurines that seem to suggest much the same thing, and that there would be an audience for it when the time came in sort of this outdoor seating around the edges of the court. So what's the reality of the Minotaur story? Well, we do know that the Minoan civilization declined. It seems like they were taken over by another civilization in Greece, which maybe suggests something along the lines of Theseus from Athens, who was like a subject of the king of Crete, coming along and overthrowing him, or at least slaying the Minotaur. That could maybe hint at some sort of sense of what actually went on. Now, this was hundreds of years before the later Greek time period that we're more familiar with. So it's quite a long time, but there could be some distant memory that gives rise to the story of the Minotaur, this idea of throwing off Crete and control. So this is giving us a sense of how we could use myth as a way of understanding history. And at the same time, it's also telling us that, the story that was one of the traditional Greek stories. There are a few different Greek stories that had a lot of different events going on and were connected to a lot of different stuff. And poets and performers would spend a lot of time telling those stories because there was just so much you could do with them. So that's one of them. Now we have to be careful not to, put too much weight on exact events and think that King Minos was a real person necessarily, but there may be a grain of truth in it. Similarly, we also have the story of the Trojan War. So that was the other one. The Trojan War is known to us through two big epic poems. One of them is called the Iliad, and the other is called the Odyssey. Now, this seems to have been a myth that was popular even before the the Odyssey and the Iliad were composed. But these are probably the best known versions of them. And they were popular after too, with new interpretations. And so the story of the Trojan War goes something like this. Once upon a time, the goddess of strife, Eris, decided that she was going to cause some strife. So she did this at a wedding where one of the gods was marrying a mortal. And they appeared to this Trojan. So this Trojan young man named Paris. Well, actually, what Eris did, Eris left behind on a table a mysterious golden apple, which said, "To the fairest," or "To the most beautiful." And so three goddesses started arguing over who was the most beautiful. And Eris had done her job. She had started an argument. And eventually, this is going to lead to a war. And the three goddesses were Athena, Aphrodite, and Hera. And Athena says, if you pick me, these goddesses are not above bribery. Athena says, if you pick me, I will make you the most brilliant commander who can win any war. And Paris says, nah. And then Hera says, oh, well, I'll do it better. I'll just make you rule all these kingdoms and all these nations if you pick me. And Paris says, nah. And then Aphrodite says, if you pick me, I'll make the most beautiful woman in the world fall in love with you. So that was the perfect thing for a young man like Paris. And so Aphrodite made Helen, who was a Greek woman living in Sparta. She was actually married to the king of Sparta. So this was going to be a problem. So she ran off with Paris, whether by her own choice or by Paris's choice, we don't really know. And the Greeks started a war with Troy to get her back. And actually, the word Greeks isn't used. It's a group called Achaeans, but these are kind of thought of as like proto-Greeks. Later on, they're thought of as a Greek culture going up against a foreign culture, these Trojans. So that's Helen of Troy. She's not really from Troy. She is famous, though, for being in Troy. And the Greeks fight for 10 years to get her back. It turns out to be a longer war than they thought it was going to be. So Menelaus goes off to get his wife back, and his brother Agamemnon, who is a real piece of work, Agamemnon is the king of a place called Mycenae, which seems to be maybe the most powerful city in this story. So we've got Sparta and Mycenae as being these important cities. There's also some other characters like Achilles. He is like this young warrior who is maybe the greatest warrior of all time. And we've got Odysseus, who is the most clever man in Greek mythology. Odysseus also gets his own story, which is called the Odyssey. But he appears in the story of the Trojan War as well. He comes up with the plan of the, quote, Trojan horse. And this is an idea where the Greeks trick the Trojans into getting them into their city. What they do is they make a giant wooden horse and they hide inside it. Now you might wonder, why did the Trojans want to wheel this into their city? It was obviously suspicious, right? Well, it's because they thought the Greeks were making this kind of offering to the gods, a gift to the gods. And they said, oh, I've got it. We're going to steal their offering and make it our own offering. Oh, how devilish. So they decided to do that, but that was what Odysseus and the Greeks had been planning all along. So now the Greeks are in the city's gates get open, and the rest of the Greeks can come in, and Troy is destroyed. Very tragic. But interestingly, that doesn't actually appear in the Iliad, the epic poem I had you read. It more appears in, we know it's part of the story of the Trojan War, but the Iliad is just about one part of the Trojan War. The Odyssey is about Odysseus's journey home to get back to his homeland. It takes him a long time, and he encounters lots of gods and monsters along the way. The Iliad is the story of one sort of major set of battles, one incident, I guess you could say, during the battle for Troy, getting closer to the end of it. And it's the story of a sort of conflict between Achilles and Agamemnon. And it is the story of basically Achilles refusing to fight and being this very powerful warrior who, in this mythology, one warrior can make all the difference. And Achilles is staying in his tent and refusing to go off to battle. Why? Because Agamemnon angered him, because they had these captives, and Agamemnon took the captive woman from him that Achilles was going to keep for his own part of his own spoils, his own treasure. So these are conquerors. These are not nice people. But Achilles has been offended by this attitude of Agamemnon's and vice versa. What ultimately brings Achilles back into the battle is his beloved Patroclus dying. So Patroclus, some stories interpret them as having a platonic friendship. A lot of Greeks interpreted it as a romantic relationship between Achilles and the other warrior, Patroclus. And so when Patroclus goes off to fight in Achilles' armor instead and then dies, that's what spurs Achilles into battle. And he goes off and he becomes a powerhouse and takes out one of the most important of the Trojan warriors. And then eventually Achilles is going to die himself, being shot with an arrow. Apollo didn't like him very much, so Apollo is associated with archery, so he got taken out of the picture effectively. And then Achilles, that was the only part on his body that he was vulnerable. And so that's the tragedy, is that he was not vulnerable everywhere. And so this is the idea of the Achilles heel. He was shot in the heel, and that was what killed him. So that's all sort of the mythology of it. So as you can see, there's a lot going on here. There's wars, there's battle, there's sort of Greeks versus foreign cultures. There's a lot of gods playing around on the sidelines. But what are these epic poems actually? Well, what they were performances. They were compositions. People talk about a guy named Homer, but Homer is kind of a made-up name. Most historians are kind of in agreement on that. Homer is a made-up name. If there was a real Homer, he's not someone we really know too much about, because these stories were told by many, many people, and eventually they just kind of trickled down to us in a particular version. This is oral composition, so they weren't written down like you'd write a story. They were told as a kind of musical performance almost. And that's the thing, we have the lyrics, we don't have the music. So when we're reading like one of these epic poems like the Iliad, what we have is effectively a song in transcription and translation. But it is telling a story too. And so there seem to have been these kinds of bards who would give these performances, to kings, to places where they would, be paid for their song and given food, sing for their supper. And if there was a real Homer, he was probably one of these bards. But there are lots of different there's lots of different ways one could tell the story. And we think that these bards actually improvise quite a lot. You could change the words you were saying so long as you fit the rhythm of the song. And so there were actually strategic ways to do this. Like you could have certain descriptions of the gods. Like you could say earth-shaking Poseidon if the line was long enough for earth-shaking Poseidon. Or you could say wise Poseidon or strong Poseidon if you needed like a shorter phrase, right? So that's kind of the way they did it. And people figured out that, yeah, they were improvising quite a lot. And so what we have is kind of like the final version of them that was passed down to us. And this is the source for a lot of stories from Greek mythology. This is like one of the best versions of a lot of these stories. So it's important to think about, when we are looking at these stories, where are we getting them from? How did we get a version of this story that survived down to us today? In this case, it seems to be the Odyssey and the Iliad were famous performances that at a certain point were written down. And they had this certain rhythm to it, like if I can get the rhythm right here. Meni naede thea pelea deo Achilleos. Something like that, this da 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 da. Achilleos. Yeah, sorry, that's how it ends. Meni naede thea pelea deo Achilleos. Oh, I think you're supposed to actually blur O and ah. Oh, Achilleos. Achilleos. Something like that. But da 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 is how it's supposed to go. And so, yeah, so it's important to think about these things as sort of musical performances. And when we look at Hesiod, that's also a musical performance. So just bear that in mind. Okay, so that's my little rundown on these stories. Now, we said we were going to look at myth and history. So, is there any reality to the idea of the Trojan War? A lot of people have debated this question, and to some extent, it's still up for debate even today. Obviously, the goddesses didn't cause strife, but there may be a grain of truth to it as well. Um, so it seems like there was actually a culture that kind of corresponds to the Achaeans or early Greeks in the Odyssey and the Iliad, just as the Minoans correspond to King Minos. And one particularly notable archaeologist of sorts was a guy called Heinrich Schliemann. Now, he was kind of just doing this as a hobby project. He was really a retired banker, but that's how archaeologists were back then. And so he was convinced that the Trojan War was real, and he was going to find evidence of it and, reconstruct the lives of people like Agamemnon. And he was able to uncover a lot of new evidence of the Mycenaeans and of the Trojans. For instance, he investigated ruins that people said were the ancient city of Mycenae, and he found it to be true. There was an ancient city there. And in fact, you can see this city today. It has this pretty spectacular gate with this giant archstone, and it's on top of a big hill. So it does seem like there was this big city dominating the region. And in fact, the other major archaeological sites that we found also correspond to important places that are mentioned in the Odyssey and the Iliad. And Heinrich Schliemann also found something that sort of resembles Troy. He found a city in that location, which could plausibly be the city of Troy during this time period. We also found evidence of some of the kind of styles of armor that we see in the Iliad. For instance, a helmet made out of boar's tusks. This is something that's mentioned in the Iliad, and we've actually found a few different examples of that now. And that's pretty cool. It's also a real boast because, you got to slay a bunch of boars to make a helmet like that. So that's a sign of sort of the warrior status of this ancient society. And we also found some evidence of frescoes of them going to war against other cultures. Again, you see those helmets there. And so we found a lot of treasures and things. So today we call this culture the Mycenaeans. And so they were the second sort of phase of early Greeks. And so it is plausible that they went to war with another people over here in the area where the Trojans were supposed to be. And Heinrich Schliemann did help uncover a city in that region, which today many historians, although not all, some people say it's still kind of dubious, but some also say that it is plausible that this city was Troy. This was part of a foreign culture called the Hittites, kind of an outpost of theirs. So you could imagine that maybe the Mycenaean culture went to war with the Hittites. It is also very interesting that at the end of this time period, at the end of this early Greek civilization, it basically collapsed. It went through its own kind of apocalypse. And we don't really know why, but there seems to have been evidence of crisis throughout this whole part of the world. So some people have interpreted this as there was a big war. There was a big conflict between these Mycenaeans and these Hittites. But that may not be the whole story. And in fact, some people think that probably isn't the reason. It might have been more things like drought or, a giant sort of economic crash where they all took each other down because they were trading with each other, something along those lines. But one plausible scenario is that there was some kind of war. Now, Heinrich Schliemann took it really far. He found, ancient masks, and he says, this is the face of Agamemnon. He thought that he had found the graves of Agamemnon. And today we realize that the graves were not from the right time period to even remotely fit his hypothesis. These were much later graves. And so that doesn't add up. And I think it should caution us in general to say, we can get some historical details out of mythology sometimes. We can use myth for history, but we shouldn't imagine that there's like a one-to-one correspondence, that every mythological character has a corresponding real life figure. There may be some truth in some of these cases, maybe, but it's really hard to say, and we shouldn't just assume that it follows the story that we know. At best, we can kind of say that the myth is inspired by history and influenced by history. And other historians have said that, maybe we should look to these myths not just for the time period that they're trying to describe as this kind of distant memory, but we should look to them for the time period when the myths were being told. For instance, Homer was a few hundred years later than this Mycenaean culture. So he was only sort of dimly remembering it, and his notion of things may have been much more based on his own society. And then later on, later myths would be based on, later Athenian society or stuff like that. So it's not just the culture that kind of defines what a myth is like. It's the time and place as well. What part of Greece and when in Greece do we have these stories being told? So that's a whole sort of thing that you guys can look into if you want. But I just wanted to put all that out there, and yeah, hopefully this gives you guys some understandings of some of the complexities of Greek mythology and some of the different ways we can use mythology. And I'll be really curious to see which gods you guys want to research and to read what you learn about them. So I will see you for that. And then next time on Thursday, when I see you guys officially, I will be looking forward to talking to you about Hesiod and the theogony and the works and days, both by a poet, maybe not a real person, but a theoretical poet called Hesiod. So I'll see you guys later this week. Take care.